Hello, I'm Charity Urbanski with the University of Washington Department of History, and I'm here today with Dr. Christopher Bonura to talk about his book, A Prophecy of Empire, which will be released later this month. Welcome, Chris.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us. So I wanted to start by asking you about the main text that you investigate, the Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius. Can you tell us a little bit about the text itself and what it is?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've written this book about an apocalyptic text that was written in the 7th century by a Christian writing from the region of Mesopotamia soon after the Arab or Islamic conquest. And so this is an apocalyptic text that places recent events, especially the Islamic conquest of the Middle East, within a Christian understanding of history, a view of history. The apocalypse is a little different from what a lot of people might imagine in an apocalyptic text because it's not just a vision of the end times. It provides a world history from Adam and Eve to the end times, but with a lot of emphasis about what's going to happen in the final days of history. It reserves a very important role for the Christian Roman Empire in this end times scenario. What makes this text really interesting, though, is that even though it was written in Syriac, this dialect of Aramaic in the 7th century, very quickly it was translated from Syriac into Greek and from Greek into Latin, as well as many other languages like Armenian, Coptic, eventually Old Church Slavonic, and it spread throughout the medieval Christian world and had an enormous influence on medieval Christianity.
So it sounds very similar in many ways to the Book of Revelations, which I think most of our listeners will be a little bit more familiar with. Can you talk a little bit more about the similarities and differences between the two?
Yeah. One very important and major difference is that the Book of Revelation is the apocalypse in the Christian Bible, right? It becomes part of the New Testament, and nearly all Christian traditions accept the Book of Revelation as part of the canon. The Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius never achieves that status. But at the same time, it has this enormous influence on pre-modern Christianity. One way that it is very similar to the Book of Revelation is, like a lot of apocalyptic texts, it deals with the plight of a persecuted or troubled community, dealing with trauma, dealing with persecution, specifically at the hands of a hostile empire, right? So the Book of Revelation is usually understood as a response by an early Christian to the plight of Christians who are being persecuted in the Roman Empire. And it imagines the Roman Empire as this evil force, this sort of satanic force that's opposed to God's people, and conjures this vision of the destruction of the Roman Empire and the triumph of the forces of good, the forces of God in the end times. The Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius is similar in that it is written from the perspective of a Christian who perceives persecution at the hands of the Islamic Caliphate and is imagining a time when God will intervene in history to reverse the order of things and to ensure the return of Christian domination. Where it's different, again, is that unlike the Book of Revelation that imagines sort of the kingdom of heaven, the forces of God intervening directly within history, the Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius uses the Christian Roman Empire, it envisions the Christian Roman Empire as this force that is going to be the tool of God's will and ensure the triumph of Christianity by literally intervening and defeating the forces of Islam in the last days.
So this idea that the Roman Empire has a sort of providential role to play in history also sounds very Augustinian. How does this role of the Roman Empire and the Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius sort of fit in with Augustine's ideas of providential history?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So one thing I argue in this book is that the Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius is too often contextualized within within Byzantine or Latin Christianity. And that key to understanding this text is to understand it in its 7th century Syriac context, that this is a text written by a Christian living in what before the Islamic conquest had been the imperial borderlands between the Roman Empire and the Sasanian Empire. And in a world that was under the rule of the Islamic Caliphate. And so a Christian living quite far from the Roman Empire. And it imagines this role of the Roman Empire in the end, playing a key role in the end of time. So the apocalypse reaches its climax with this prophecy of the Roman emperor who defeats the forces opposed to Christianity, that he'll go to Jerusalem. He'll go up on Golgotha, the place where Christ was crucified. He'll take his crown. He'll place it on the cross. That cross will ascend to heaven, and Christ will immediately return with the crown of empire and the cross. And so there's this continuity between the Roman Empire and Christ's kingdom that will reign for all time, right? So it's laying out a much more central and important role for the Roman Empire in history, I argue, than virtually any other text that's imagining the end times, right? And as it gets translated out of Syriac into new contexts, like in the Byzantine world, like in medieval Latin Christendom, it's often used to argue against people like Augustine, right, who will say that the Roman Empire maybe has some sort of role in history, but God doesn't care too much about empires, that the loyalty of a true Christian should be to the city of God, to the kingdom of heaven, right? You may be a citizen of Rome, a citizen of the earthly city, but your loyalty should be to the kingdom of God, right? Pseudo-Methodius makes no such distinction. The Roman Empire is the force of God's will in history.
Yeah, it's a very different vision of the Roman Empire from the one that Augustine sort of proposes. So I'm very interested in some of the antecedents of Pseudo-Methodius. What texts is he borrowing from? Perhaps embroidering?
Yeah, so in attempting to contextualize this apocalypse in its Syriac milieu, I've looked into what kind of texts influenced it. And I argue that it's coming from a tradition of Syriac literature, especially written by Christians in that pre-Islamic borderland region between the Roman and the Sasanian Persian empires. And Christians living in the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire, Christians living in the Persian Empire, who would look to the Roman Empire as sort of an idealized state from afar, right? So I put a lot of emphasis on the influence of this 4th century writer, Aphrahat, on the Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius. Aphrahat's writing in the 4th century during the reign of Emperor Constantine, the emperor who legalized Christianity in the Roman Empire and promoted Christianity. But Aphrahat is writing not in the Roman Empire, but as a member of the persecuted Christian minority in the Persian Empire. And I argue that Aphrahat and many of the other Syriac sources that are influencing Pseudo-Methodius treat the Roman Empire a bit like later Western Christians would envision the kingdom of Prester John, right? As this almost mystical foreign Christian land, this idealized Christian kingdom that could come to help to liberate persecuted Christians living in other places. And as part of that, giving it this very central role in God's plan for history.
So you mentioned that Pseudo-Methodius also goes on to have many afterlives. Can you talk a little bit more about the way it is used after the 7th century?
Yeah, absolutely. So very quickly, it's translated from Syriac into Greek and has an enormous role and has an enormous influence in the Byzantine Empire. Essentially, every Byzantine apocalyptic text written from the 8th century on bears some influence from the Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius. And I argue one of the reasons it's really popular in the Byzantine world is whenever the empire is in a state of danger, right? In the 8th century, it was the Arab conquests. Also, other peoples are encroaching on Byzantine territory, like the Lombards, like the Bulgars, that the Byzantines can look to this text as a prophecy that confirms that, yes, even when things look bleak, the empire has to win in the end. It has to survive because it must be a Roman emperor that is a Byzantine emperor who will go to Jerusalem at the end of times and set in motion the last events by surrendering his crown. It also moves into other contexts, like in the Latin West, right? That emperor is then reimagined as a Holy Roman emperor. One of the German emperors, right, who take the title Roman Emperor. In fact, sort of coincidentally, one of the same titles used by the Holy Roman emperors is the title in the Latin translation of Pseudo-Methodius for this final emperor who's going to go to Jerusalem at the end of time. And I argue there that this text becomes really important to the self-image of the Holy Roman emperors, especially when they come in conflict with the papacy, with the popes in the wake of the Gregorian reform. So the popes are claiming the mantle as the leaders of the Christian community and arguing that anybody who infringes on that, any ruler who tries to infringe upon the rights of the church and the position of the pope is an antichrist. So the popes start using apocalyptic language in their growing conflict with the German emperors. And so Pseudo-Methodius plays this extremely important role for the supporters of those emperors who want to claim, no, we're not the Antichrist. In fact, it is the German emperors, it is the Holy Roman emperors who are the foremost leaders of Christendom, who have the most important role to play because it's a Holy Roman emperor who must go to Jerusalem and surrender his crown, that he'll play the central role that God deems necessary to bring about the end of time.
It sounds like a really fascinating and influential text, and I'm really interested in how you came to find it. How did you come to this project?
Yeah, I got interested in this text because I was very interested in medieval apocalyptic literature. And as I was reading on this topic, I kept coming across the Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius and its influence in all sorts of places I didn't expect it, right? It has this enormous influence on Byzantine thought. In the West, it's potentially influencing Dante's writing, and Christopher Columbus refers to it. There's probable references to it in the Ethiopian national epic. So it's this text that moved around the medieval and early modern Christian world and had this enormous influence, but there was no single book about it. There was translations and critical editions, but no book that really tried to make sense of why Christians were so drawn to this apocalypse through the Middle Ages and how they adapted it to their specific circumstances. So I tried to draw all this evidence together to give a single coherent picture of the creation and the afterlife of this apocalyptic text.
Well, we're very fortunate to have you doing that. And if you'd like to hear more about Chris's book, you can come to the launch event on Tuesday, November 18th at 3:45 p.m. in the Peterson Room of the UW's Allen Library. Thanks for listening and thanks for being with us, Chris.
Thank you so much.